We cannot allow the natural passions and prejudices of other peoples to lead our country to destruction.
Last summer, the NSA director was at a conference, and he was asked a question about the NSA surveillance of Americans. He replied, and I quote here, "The story that we have millions or hundreds of millions of dossiers on people is completely false." The reason I'm asking the question is, having served on the committee now for a dozen years, I don't really know what a dossier is in this context. So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are and whoever you are. This is Ben McLeish, and this is TZM Global. This week we speak to Chris Abbott, a gentleman who runs an outfit called OpenBriefing, which acts as a civil society intelligence agency. Amid the growing power and wide-reaching effects and abilities of things like the NSA and GCHQ in the UK, and everything that entails for liberty and methods of being able to run society in ways that very much are down to and hinge on controlling the information and knowing as much about you as possible. I always maintain, for the purposes of advertising, but also, of course, for tracking and all kinds of other shenanigans, it is interesting to speak to a organization which deliberately runs in the alternative direction and tries to gather as much information as possible, mostly on publicly known military projects, things like drones, which are spoken about this week on the show quite frequently, and then releases that information into the public domain. This is what Chris Abbott does with his team at OpenBriefing. So I would recommend, ahead of my interview with him, which starts in just a moment, to have a look at openbriefing.org, and particularly to the links that are posted with this show, including their 82-page PDF document, completely open, completely for free, which was commissioned by the Remote Control Project on armed combative drones. It's a very interesting read. It goes all the way down to even the specifics of the physical construction of these drones in terms of wing size, load, fuel, and all the rest of it, along with the way that these have been deployed. As you'll hear from the interview, Chris interviews rather nicely, and this is partly, of course, down to him being a charming young chap and all the rest of it, but mostly I think also because I think, and I don't want to second guess his motives, but I get the impression speaking to him, and just by understanding the logic of OpenBriefing, that he essentially agrees that there has to be security and sustainability, two elements which he actually writes online quite prolifically about with his team, has to be built into the social layer, has to be built into the everyday life and the basic value system of any society. Only upon that can you produce technologies that can be good rather than be used for ill. I think that comes through in the recording. I explained to him what the Zeitgeist movement was before, and make it clear, as always, that the guests that we have may not be openly affiliated with us, may even disagree with us on certain points. But I think you'll hear after the something like hour-long interview that I have with Chris tonight that we agree on all the important stuff when it comes to a basic understanding of values informing the operant nature of a society. And, of course, how we change that, well, that's what we're even talking to you on the radio for to begin with. Now, before I get into that, and so to avert a thump in the head by several gentlemen who've reminded me over the last couple of weeks that I needed to have done this, if you are new to the Zeitgeist movement, we periodically try and remind people how they can get involved, because coming as you do, perhaps, to our movement and seeing that we're speaking about global reorientation to real long-term, actual, physical, real-world sustainability, and moving away from a market paradigm, a market psychology of selling to each other at all costs and at the cost of the earth as well as to each other, that is, of course, a global, huge thing. It can feel very difficult to feel like you're participating in that. So the easiest way to approach or to begin your interactions with the movement, as you find it now, is to either join your local chapter or to start one. That sounds like a big deal, but essentially the Zeitgeist movement is constructed around the world from localized chapters that are essentially set up once somebody voices an interest, who can then also display very basically that they understand the train of thought and the logic and what their motivations are and what they might do and all the rest of it. Once that's done, it's essentially an independent chapter that runs by itself. You can go to tzmchapters.net and find immediately a map of every chapter that there is that's been registered on here. There probably are more, but of course we rely, as you might imagine, on the integrity of each chapter to register their own existence online. We don't want to be sitting around tracking all this stuff in a way that's too intrusive. But there should be the tools there to bring all these together and produce a view, if you like, of spots around the world where people engage in this kind of talk and try and bring into the 21st century both economics and politics and all the rest of it through a social bent. tzmchapters.net, you can then navigate to any of the menu items. There's one that just says start, and you can then start a chapter, or you can engage with the community, or you can suggest project ideas or have success stories. There's even a forum built into it as well. So that's the most practical element of starting a chapter or getting involved with your local one. By the way, you may also choose quite happily to tinker away by not joining a chapter. It may surprise some, but I don't actually myself belong to a chapter in the strictest sense. I'm in London quite a lot, and when I am and the chapters things are happening there, I always go along, of course. But I'm some kind of strange hermit who lives in an ivory tower and blathers away on public lectures, and haven't, unfortunately, due to various things, including a travel schedule that is quite demanding, been able to reliably create a chapter. And that is, of course, what we're looking for. We're looking for a certain sense of reliability so that the expectations of a started chapter can be met by regular meetings, perhaps something like once a month, maybe more if you can, maybe once every 6 weeks, who knows, as long as it's a regular thing. People get very frustrated, especially in the activist space, if something starts up and then isn't maintained. It feels like an uphill struggle anyway, and that can only feel like more like an uphill struggle when you actually have a hard time maintaining something. Of course, we do all this without money. It's not a paid thing. It's essentially volunteered. And that, of course, makes it tricky anyway. Who can work for free in this culture? And how much free time do you have once you have expended your billable hours for your, what we don't call slavery, but what so obviously is, often in the service of very redundant jobs, one must say. All of this is spoken about quite regularly in our materials. But nevertheless, try and maintain, if you are going to do it, trying to maintain a fair amount of reliability. And if you are going to, for example, gear up for the next talking point which I have, which is Zeitgeist Day 2013, and you want to help out with these day-long lectures that happen all around the world, make sure that when you offer your time that you also have it to give, because people don't want to hassle you. If you are free and you can do it, that'd be great. So I'll explain Zeitgeist Day to anybody who is tuning in for the first time, which is always a minority. They're always there. There was always a decent number of new people that listen to this stuff or happen across it in some way. Zeitgeist Day is a usually second weekend in March based awareness day. It's essentially organized in lecture halls. We've done them in theaters. We've done them in Quaker centers. Quaker centers around the world are very good, actually. They're very cheap. They're a pacifist organization, and they have a lot in common in terms of non-violence, and have been supportive in the past, certainly in the London area, and I think even places like Kent and other places as well. There's usually a Friends meeting house in your city. It's usually not very well advertised, but they do exist. If that's not big enough, lecture halls at universities tend to be fairly easy to rent out as well. And what happens is people organize a day, sometimes 8 hours, sometimes 6, sometimes 4, sometimes it's 2 days, of lectures given by members of the movement or by third-party speakers from other organizations who feel comfortable speaking to our membership about their particular angle they may have. We did this last year in two different ways, or at least two different ways. The roughly what we call the main event, which tends to be where the more seasoned speakers tend to congregate in order to particularly highlight, 5 or 6 or something like sometimes 10 particular lectures. The main one this year in 2013 in March was in Los Angeles, and it was all members from the movement from various cities and around the world coming to give their particular perspectives and the experiences of the last year. But it's mostly academic, it's mostly a topic, and it's mostly very much like TED, if you can imagine, in terms of the style, not in terms of the absolute perfection of a lot of the TED events, but it feels like that. This has been done by others as well, of course. There's the amazing meeting, which is run by the Skeptic Society, who do not see us as friends, unfortunately, to a great extent. That's for another topic. This is a sort of a very decent way of meeting up now, and a nice way of showcasing a particular set of viewpoints. That was one way of doing it. And in London, at around the same time, Jim Phillips, who runs our education division, essentially, by running it, he's a crazed one single man who runs around schools blathering to children about a resource-based economy and natural law and what it would mean to add all the technology in the way it really would be unimpeded. He runs around in a Duracell bunny style fashion, and he organized this year's event in which he went very much the other way. And he simply, with one speaker from the Zeitgeist movement, himself I think it was, he then got 6 or 7 other organizations who have particular elements that agree with us to come and present their viewpoints. So it really was like TED, where people are essentially non-affiliated to each other and have maybe been in different arenas, different areas, or have different talking points or different projects, and essentially showcase them to a community who is trying to knit this all together and curate a worldview and a media presence of what a real, true, sustainable value set. One that doesn't simply use the accumulation of money or the expenditure thereof as some kind of gauge for our health. We are looking at gross national happiness and gross national technological ability, and, of course, above all else, the broad efficiency on a technical basis and the open availability without a price tag to all the fruits of our technological progress and scientific discoveries on this planet. If you are also new to the movement and any of the above makes absolutely no sense to you and you wonder what it is exactly that I'm speaking about, you can look for the TZM, as we call it, Zeitgeist Movement Orientation Guide, which is, I would say, 9/10 done now and features just many, by now several hundred pages of essay-formed, long-form explanations with references to economic materials and psychological and psychiatric works which explain and develop the ideas of violence in society and everything that runs through things like prison, mental health, pharmaceutical machinations and all the rest of it. Everything that feeds into a broad understanding of public health and technological ability, right down to including estimates for energy support for the entire planet and what kind of infrastructure that might require, which was most recently covered by Peter Joseph in his lecture in Berlin called Economic Calculation in a Natural Law Resource-Based Economy. You may begin with that. There will be video versions of these, but as yet they are in PDF form and will at some point be available in a printed book form for a nominal fee that really will just cover the actual printing of the book, be as cheap as possible, basically. But also available for free, completely, in its full form, chapter by chapter and as one large download, probably as an ebook eventually once we get around to formatting and typesetting that, which you may familiarize yourself with the kind of information that we speak about and which we always make for free. Do not pay for it if you cannot also get it for free. That is our mantra and our motto for everything which we hold as centerpieces of our own expression, of our viewpoint. You can get to it without paying for it, always, even if there is also a paid version. We make no secret of that, and we try and make it as obvious as possible. You may have come here through the films which come to depict the kind of a worldview which the movement then tries to express on its own. If so, then you may also enjoy Culture in Decline by Peter Joseph, or some of the many lectures by many of our seasoned speakers like Matt Berkowitz and Douglas Millett, and Federico Pistono, who's essentially an entrepreneur who does very futuristic, socially based technologies, very interesting stuff. He also wrote a book on technological unemployment, which is also available for free on his site or as a download on Kindle and all the rest of it. I have a hardback with a satirically hateful message from him in the front asking me to never contact him again, which I laughed about endlessly. That is my opening screed. That is the opening part of this show, and I will now cut to my interview, which was recorded last week with Chris Abbott, with one brief proviso, and that is that something that has happened in the last week, since the recording of the interview, in fact, last week, a couple of stories have come to light. You will hear that Chris and I speak about Amazon employing drones for deliveries of packages. And there is the general discussion that in addition to military employment of modern technologies, another backdoor channel which informs modern opinion, usually through fictitious media, which we talk about, and also through commercial employment, you find drones making their way quite rapidly, actually, without some real updates to the values which are required into modern life. And since Chris and I had that discussion, Google has bought a company that we have spoken about before, called Boston Dynamics, who produced the Big Dog Pack robot and various other robots, and essentially automatic warfare-based robots. No one's sure yet really what Google's doing with it. There's no consensus really in the media, other than the fact that Google is very secretive, and I'm sure some of this stuff will be very obvious and probably quite harmless, but there is the other side, which is the fact that they have indeed bought military contractor robotics organizations, companies which they are now integrating with their other already very wide-reaching information products and their Google Glass technology, which allows this very layered effect of technology over an ability or some kind of interface. And what that may be used for can actually be quite frightening when you think about it. Just look up the Big Dog and look up Boston Dynamics and see also the articles that have come out about it. In fact, as I record this, which is in fact on the 18th of December, it's the very day that this show is going out, there are USA Today covered it 2 hours ago, Forbes has covered it, and quite a few others have produced videos as well. Try not to get too paranoid about the Skynet side of things, because that's what some of the videos actually do explicitly portray this as, but nevertheless, we do have to ask ourselves the question about where we let autonomous technology go. And as Chris will speak about in the interview, it is concerning, to say the least, to see the loop of decision-making moving towards the more automated side of things, and with less and less human interaction. There is a link in this episode to something related to high-frequency trading. That's worth reading as well. We discuss it in the interview as well. So with all of that said, welcome to the new, hello to the old, and here is my interview with Chris Abbott of OpenBriefing. So, Chris Abbott, welcome to TZM Global Radio. Thank you for coming on the show, yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
So, listen, tell me what OpenBriefing is. Give our listeners an idea of what you've been running as your project.
OpenBriefing is, to all intents and purposes, an intelligence agency for civil society. We are the People's Intelligence Agency. We try to bring some of the methodology, some of the approaches that the government has through its intelligence agencies, but we try to bring them to bear for civil society groups and non-governmental organisations, and work towards progressive social change.
What started you on this path? How did you get involved?
My background's in think tanks, in the peace and security think tank sector in particular. I was the deputy director of an organisation called Oxford Research Group. And I finished in Oxford Research Group about 2009 and worked for a while as a freelance writer, which gave me the space, I suppose, to kind of think back over my years in the think tank and civil society sector and think about perhaps what wasn't working, what was working, and what was needed. And I slowly came to the idea of OpenBriefing. And the reality of it is it came from two places. One is that I just felt that so much of what civil society was trying to do at the policy level was just as ideologically driven as government policy often is, and that actually does no one any favors, and that if we could base policy development on solid evidence base, that would be a good way forward. And the second reason was I kind of felt that why should just those with power and money have access to intelligence agencies, have access to that kind of capacity and that kind of capability, and that maybe the two could be brought together and we could actually do something to sort of behind the scenes to take forward the way we do think tanks.
I've always wanted to ask someone who's worked at a think tank what it's like, because they're such strange organizations to me. They, as you say, they tend to be, at least in the main, groups or clumping togethers of ideologically driven individuals. You'll have, I maintain that they're a think tank, the Ludwig von Mises Institute, who are essentially the guardians of things like Austrian economics, a particular form of capitalism. Or you have various religious think tanks and a lot of right-wing, as we would call right-wing, politically driven think tanks that promote, for example, anything that would work for the right in America. I'm thinking of things like the Project for the New American Century. So what's it like being inside one of these organizations? Not that yours may have been right-wing, but in terms of the organization, how it is day to day, what does it strike? How can you describe it?
It's very earnest, full of very serious people, genuinely doing what they think is right for the world. Is how I've sort of found it to be. But you're right. It's essentially a kind of self-selecting group of people with a particular worldview working together to promote that worldview. And that can be relatively benign, or it can be a relatively positive, if you either agree with their worldview or they happen to have a particularly positive approach. But obviously, some of those examples that you mentioned, I would argue, bring ill to the world, and that their perspective and their approach to dealing with policy is dangerous. Unfortunately, often they tend to have the largest support base and the most power. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to take a step back with OpenBriefing and build it right from the very get-go on rigorous methodologies, on deliberately selecting quite a wide background, from a wide background for our team. And we build in all sorts of techniques and ways of working that try to break down some of the traps that you fall into when you work with a group of people that might agree with you. Just simple little things like every team has a devil's advocate, whose job it actually is to put the alternative perspective, to argue the other way. Just little tricks like that we can bring to bear on our work, that we try to deliberately be as objective as we possibly can be. And it's not something that every non-governmental organization does. I'm not saying they're all in the same boat, but I would argue that the vast majority of civil society, as does the vast majority of government, argues from a case of ideology and assumption rather than research and evidence.
Did you see during your time when you were at your prior think tanks, policy pushed through that you, or a position or work put through, or a report written with which you fundamentally disagreed?
I'm trying to think. Not that I can think of a concrete example of a report that I would have disagreed with. I certainly was never involved in one. I wouldn't have been. But obviously there would be the civil society and the think tank world covers a massive spectrum of political opinion and ways of viewing the world. So there would have been reports coming out from other think tanks that I probably would have wholeheartedly disagreed with if they were arguing from a particularly militaristic point of view, for example. But what I did see definitely was a kind of certain degree of shared assumption and sort of unquestioned kind of givens that drove a lot of work within the peace and security sector. And, you know, a lot of that was for sort of genuinely held and quite possibly quite positive beliefs. Pacifism, for example. You know, a lot of organizations in the peace and security sector come from a pacifist standpoint. And that's, you know, that's a positive worldview if it's what you subscribe to. But it also does involve looking at the world in a very particular way and constantly arguing policy from that standpoint. Even when, you know, in some examples, military interventions may be the most sound policy choice forward. So I certainly saw examples of that.
And how long has OpenBriefing been running now?
I founded it in May 2011 and we launched in October of that year. So we've been up and running publicly about 2 years.
Wow. And how's the experience been? How's it run so far?
The experience has been tiring, but it's been good. It's been really well received, actually. I think, like a lot of sort of quite different ideas and a lot of new ideas, people either get it and love it and you know, want to support it and want to see us run with it and think it's wonderful, or people just kind of scratch their heads and don't really understand what it is and what it's trying to do. We've had both. Yeah, we've had both sets of reactions, but we've got some good funding. We need a lot more, but we're getting there, and we're slowly putting it together. And we've got a great team. We've managed to attract analysts from I think about a dozen different countries now, many with backgrounds in government and intelligence work, law enforcement, the military. These are serious thinkers with excellent backgrounds, and we've been, you know, really lucky to attract them to come on board in our team. And the most amazing thing about it is that they're all volunteers. So no one involved on the analytical teams in the intelligence unit is a paid member of staff. So that's sort of saying something about their level of commitment to the idea, and it's been pretty well received. Yeah.
It's interesting. There'll be 2 points that will resound with the membership who are listening to this. You mentioned that you said that there's a great deal of society's values that are essentially based on, let's call it what it is, myth. Phenomenal assumptions which may not have a basis in the world, or maybe no longer have a base in the world. This is something we talk about all the time. It's something that is not self-evident, because for a society based on such presuppositions to exist, it essentially has to be blind to the fact that those suppositions may be false or may be open to question or updating. So people very much will take on board that point of yours. It's also interesting that your analysts are all volunteers. We're essentially also a volunteer organization. There are no paid membership spaces, and there couldn't really be, because we try and argue for a post-money world. So the least we can involve this stuff, the better. But how do you manage to stay financially afloat then, given the fact that you're surrounded by a system that demands this?
Yeah, I mean, we're not everyone in the. I mean, I'm paid for what I do. This is my full-time job. I run the organization. There's about 25 people involved, and it's a full-time job managing everybody. So I'm paid, for my role as the executive director of the organization. But I took a deliberate approach when I was setting up the organization to go down the volunteer route, because one of the things that's incredibly difficult for a new non-governmental organization is to access funding. Is to become, as the new kid on the block, you're constantly trying to get a foot in the door, and there's already 50 other organizations, one step ahead of you, who've already been funded by these funders that are already known that they're going to fund ahead of you. So I knew this from the start. So I really wanted to pursue the volunteer model, simply because I've got a team of 20 odd people on the books now, and there's no way I could do that with with a standard corporate model. It just wouldn't happen. So that works really well for us, and it enables us to have lots of really interesting people on board, because most of these people, either are consultants in their own right, or they have full-time jobs in other organizations, in other companies, NATO and places like that. And that allows us to have a really interesting, the involvement of really interesting people that we couldn't have if they were sort of employed by us. So it kind of works as a positive for us. And, if someone turned around tomorrow and said, here's £1 million, go run your civil society intelligence agency, then obviously we would get a lot more paid support staff and a lot more paid. I think we need sort of paid members at the kind of managerial level to kind of coordinate all the different teams that we have running. But I would still embrace that volunteer model, because I think once you've got someone involved at the level that we have our analysts, they really sign up to the project, and they're doing it for the kind of right reasons. It's not just a job, in the sort of monetary sense, which is fantastic. I mean, the flip side to that is, it takes a lot of my time recruiting people, interviewing people, inducting people, managing people, to find those individuals with the right skill sets and the right approach, and that takes up a lot of my time. But I suppose unlike yourselves, we're not a mass movement in that sense. There's a kind of core group of volunteers and staff and advisors, and then our wider network, I suppose, of supporters. And perhaps one thing that would be to our benefit would be to draw in that wider network of supporters and actually make that a more proactive role, so that we did sort of slowly start to become a kind of more of a mass movement. I don't know. It's something I'm kind of thinking about at the moment.
It's funny you should answer this question the way you did, because I was about to invite you to a thought experiment. When you were speaking about funding, I, for a very brief period, worked for a company that basically tracked funding for new startups, mostly in technology and green and clean tech. And I went to one of these places where companies who are startups essentially are pitching to a room full of investors about their idea. And I watched as a gentleman, a very, very charismatic gentleman, demonstrated his online website, which was basically a social gaming, casual gaming series. And he explained during the interview, or the pitch essentially that he had, that during Valentine's Day, players of a certain sort of social game where you can, almost like The Sims, move around and interact in a text-based way with a graphical background, bought for each other using real money something like 200,000 virtual roses on Valentine's Day. Now, this gentleman's website, I won't name it because you would probably find it if you knew when I was talking about. It eventually sold for something like 50 million. And so I ask you, what can you imagine doing with 50 million pounds if it were spent on something, in my opinion, a little bit more worthy than a casual gaming website? What would you put in place? Would you have offices around the world? Or, how could you imagine if you had unlimited funds? Where would you take this project? And what do you think the effect would be?
Yeah, it's. Are you offering? Have you got some money that tucked away that you're willing to donate with us?
I'm down to my last 100 million. Sorry.
No, it's an interesting question, and one that we have not obviously grappled with to that extent, but we've thought about our model and kind of, is the model we have, is it something that could be upscaled? I mean, can we just keep doing this forever and ever and ever and ever and have kind of, 2,000 volunteer analysts working? And probably not is the answer. There becomes a degree of oversight and coordination that would just become quite unwieldy. You'd need to break it down into sort of, I'm not too sure about offices around the world, but I would like to think of kind of regional hubs. So we still, we do all our work online. Everything's done over the internet, and there's no need to have physical brick and mortar offices anymore. But I would probably want to set up a kind of series of regional hubs where our different desks could sort of be coordinated from, and we may well have meeting spaces or whatever there, but they would be more work hubs than kind of actual, offices, bricks and mortar offices. And then really, actually, I would recruit more managers to manage volunteer teams, essentially. So we still use that model. But what it would allow us to do would be to use much more, to buy in many more services and to access capabilities we don't have at the moment. So, for example, we could access satellite imagery, which is a phenomenal tool for some of our work. And we could access commercial satellite imagery on a huge scale, which would be wonderful. And we could also do a lot more on the ground intelligence gathering, recruiting people in certain institutions and in different parts of the world to work for us openly. But that kind of thing would be wonderful. And we'd also have a really, really, really good website.
Well, I must say, I think your website is actually very slick. I was on it today. I've been on it a few times recently. And I think you lay it out rather well, because by your nature, you're talking about global issues that are phenomenally hard to lay out without getting the user lost. So I think you've done a decent job, actually.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Due to the nature of how our social organization works, the Zeitgeist movement, I mean, we tend to talk about global problems and have a very global worldview. And what can get lost in that sometimes is the ability to talk about individual problems. Because if we bang on a lot about the whole system, we mean that there are systemic issues inherent in all the way that all societies are run, which are coherently or incoherently, I suppose, destroying the planet. And it then becomes very hard to backpedal and talk about a particular issue, because we don't tend to be a single issue organization. However, there's something that has been on my mind recently that I think you've probably covered quite a lot, that I wanted for us to maybe riff on for a session, and that is the subject of drones, both military and private. Tell me, when did you first come across this stuff, and what have you guys published about drone warfare and drones in general?
Yeah, I couldn't tell you when I first kind of came across this issue. It's kind of one of those ones that's been slowly building up in the background for a very long time, slightly under the radar for certainly for the kind of conventional media and most people, but has been sort of slowly beginning to build up under the radar as technology has enabled policymakers to do new things. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head how long I've been kind of aware of it, but it's certainly something that OpenBriefing has been working on. In fact, we published a fairly major report into armed drones in, I think it was, well, we published a report in September, I think it was. And that was looking at armed drones in China, India, Israel, Iran, Russia, and Turkey. And that was a major piece of work. Actually, it wasn't so much a piece of analysis, although there was analysis in there, but it was simply drawing up an inventory of the sort of unmanned combat air vehicles, the armed drones that each of those countries have in their inventory, and that was a really interesting and difficult piece of work, actually, just to try and get a picture of kind of, the numbers and the capabilities of the drones, particularly armed drones, that each of those countries were able to deploy. And we actually identified, just within those 6 countries, we actually identified 200 unmanned aerial vehicles, 200 different unmanned aerial vehicles, and 29 unmanned combat air vehicles, armed drones, just in those 6 countries. So that was an incredibly interesting piece of work. And off the back of that, we've begun to do sort of more policy discussion and more work from that very, well, not simple, but from that very focused piece of work on simply drawing up an inventory so that we have a better understanding of the capabilities that are available to different countries.
Tell me, when you were doing your research, what was the most egregious example of drone warfare that you found? I should actually point out before I ask that, sorry, for anybody who's not quite clear yet on what drones are, although I think that's unlikely, these are, as Chris says, unmanned aerial vehicles. They look very, very strange. They have appeared most prominently in quite a lot of films recently. These sort of white domed, very thin vehicles that look like miniature aeroplanes that are essentially unmanned, controlled from places in Nevada on a screen, very much almost like a video game, but with real-world consequences. And these things are armed and have detonatable explosives in them. And, of course, most importantly, I would say, aside from the sheer violence of them, equipment for very, very high-definition reconnaissance, recordings, tracking people, this kind of stuff on a general level. But I must say, and I think I mentioned this to you, Chris, when we met, the most notable examples and the earliest examples seem to have been in the media in things like 24. 24, with basically a shrug of the shoulder, included them as central tools for the underground bunker of the 24 series to essentially spy on areas of New York to trap, in their storyline, terrorists, as they're called. And this was nonchalantly put on the screen, and I found it was essentially a normalizing effect to get a large section of the population used to seeing these things in urban areas over civilian areas, monitoring and at a moment's notice moving around the city at extreme speeds and with a lot of dexterity. So that has struck me as being an interesting thing. But that's essentially what drones are. Most notably, actually, quite recently, and Chris, you'll have probably seen this as well, Amazon have announced that they're going to employ hundreds of drones to deliver packages that are ordered online within 30 minutes of the order being completed. And interestingly enough, the most resounding comment on the internet seems to have been that these things are going to be used for target practice by an armed nation. So the general point I want to make to you, and I want to see if you'd agree or whether you have a different reading of it, is that all of these effects, these technological effects that seem to be first employed in the army, make their way into general societal use through advertising and through business. And that's what I think, are already seeing. We're seeing a large employment of drones, several hundred, as you say, probably thousands if you count everybody together. But then you see this filtering into the industrial complex, into the more Amazon-based complex. And then how long is it going to be before we have our own personal drones? What do you think?
I've got one.
Have you?
No. You raised several interesting points there. I mean, just on the note of kind of, how long will it be before we've all got one? I mean, drones, as far as I'm concerned, anyways, drones in and of themselves are not, I don't know what word to use, but aren't evil weapons.
Not desirable.
Yeah, there are some weapons that I would sort of argue that are just so abhorrent to kind of human nature that they should never, ever be deployed or used. And I'm not sure. I don't think drones falls into that category. It's the actual. At the end of the day, drones, when used by the armed forces armed drones when used by the armed forces, are just weapons delivery platforms. My argument is more with the policy of deploying those weapons rather than the drones in and of themselves. And actually, drones, they do have wide-ranging uses. I mean, especially as the technology becomes more readily available and far cheaper. I mean, civil society groups can deploy drones to deliver humanitarian aid. They would be wonderful for the deployment of humanitarian aid, medical aid, post-disaster, before roads are opened again or before helicopters are able to get in. Aid agencies could be deploying fleets of drones to drop medical aid and shelter to disaster-struck areas. Civil society groups can use, in fact, have been using drones to monitor protests, to monitor police reactions to protests in places like Thailand. We've seen them being deployed by rebel groups in Syria. So, drones have already become a non-governmental tool in the same way satellite imagery has nowadays. So that's kind of one thing. And my as going backwards, my sort of main issue with drones really is on the policy level. It's on the decision to deploy these weapons rather than drones in and of themselves. But you're right in terms of the way they've sort of quite quickly become part of popular culture in relatively recent years. And that's partly the media and partly, as you said, things like 24 and various books that have included them into their storylines. But as per usual, they're kind of one step behind, and actually the technology is moving at such a massive pace now that that kind of, I think the idea of drones that most people have in their mind is a little bit outdated. So we're actually getting a huge spectrum whereby missiles at one end, drones in the middle, and aircraft at the other are becoming blurred. The lines between them are becoming blurred. So at one end we have loitering munitions, which are kind of missiles that have the ability to loiter in the target area before finally going on to their intended target. Then in the middle, you've got sort of armed drones, so that we've been talking about, that can actually carry explosive munitions and to target individuals or buildings or whatever, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, these things are huge now, and they have massive payloads. That they're essentially bombers. I mean, they're incredible things, and they're looking to build in stealth technologies into these drones now as well. And then beyond that, at the aircraft range, you're seeing, and what we found in our research that I mentioned earlier, particularly the countries that don't have a very advanced weapons and military technology programs, what they're doing now is retrofitting old aircraft platforms. So we're sort of with unmanned technologies, so they can essentially fly aircraft, fighter jets by remote control. So you're kind of seeing this complete blurring of lines between sort of missile technology at one end and aircraft technology at the other. And I think we're going to end up seeing kind of this mix of manned and unmanned systems right across the kind of many different platforms. And this technology is moving at such a kind of pace that policymakers almost can't keep up with it, and civil society certainly can't keep up with it in terms of trying to restrain some of the uses of these weapon systems. The technology is allowing policymakers to make decisions and undertake military activities that they could only have dreamed of before.
Is there a silver lining to the fact that there is this continual blurring of expressions of dronism, if you like, in that it gets to a point where it becomes so difficult to disentangle the various technologies that people start thinking about the underlying value of delivering, essentially in a more efficient way, dangerous payloads to hurt other people, and they're forced to analyze the actual behavior rather than concentrate and fixate, if you like, on the technology itself.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean, and in fact, in this area, a lot of people do become quite focused on the technology and very fixated on the technology, and actually sort of almost miss the fact that these are essentially platforms for delivering death, and that sort of seems to pass people by. I'm not as optimistic though that it will become so sort of easy to deploy these things that it will actually make people stop and think. I think we're probably going to end up going the other way, because one of the sort of really worrying technological developments that does have important implications is when we start to move. Well, we've already started to move from manned to unmanned systems, but then at least they have what they call a man in the loop, or a human in the loop, whereby there is a human being has to take the final decision, yes or no. The scary technological development. So when we start to talk about autonomous systems and systems that can make the decision based on computer programming whether to deploy a missile or not, and that to me is going even further away from a kind of from any kind of detailed thought into, should we actually be deploying these things?
I recently received a very interesting article from a friend of mine about high-frequency trading. Do you know about this?
No.
So high-frequency trading is heavily deployed in the world's largest financial institutions. So Goldman Sachs is a prime example of this. And it's basically computer algorithms that trade at extreme speed, many, many millionths of a second for transactions. They can do high bulk but low individual costs, rapid fire transactions throughout the financial world during the day, much faster than any human could ever do it. And these have a relative autonomousness about them because, of course, of their speed. It means they can't really employ in any meaningful sense a human element to it other than general management or, most interestingly, working on the algorithm to improve its behavior rather than anything that you're doing directly as a decision process. Now, what's interesting thing is these are also programmed, because there's more than one, they're programmed to react to each other. They're programmed to feed off the behavior of another high-frequency trading algorithm and copy and game and try and participate and anticipate the market based on the behaviors of this relatively self-autonomous algorithm. And many, many, many ones of these have essentially created almost like a cybernetic self-governing system that is not prone to human interaction anymore and has a reason and a logic built into it that's purely crafted around money maximization and all the decisions that would go with that, and not necessarily on any human interaction anymore. And they've said that this thing is gaining a level of autonomousness, a level of not self-awareness, of course, or consciousness, none of that stuff, but a level of behavior that's sophisticated and behaves like a network, almost like a nervous system. And it's very worrying because it's splitting further and further away from what serves humanity, even further away than it was before, of course, and is heading towards something that is wholly ungoverned. Now, when this person sent it to me, they said that they found this very scary. And I actually don't, because all it will do is fuck up the financial world. It won't actually have an effect on the real world. People forget this. Now, it does, in the short term, massive bankruptcies and layoffs, of course, produce horrendous real-world conditions. But the moving of money itself, just on an abstract sense, has nothing to do with reality. You could do whatever you wanted with it, and the world would still be going through night and day, and there would still be oxygen in the atmosphere and all the rest of it. Now, what is not the same as that is the idea of autonomous drones and autonomous warfare machines, which are literally having an impact on the real world, because their goal, rather than maximizing money, is to produce death in human beings. And there was a story, I hope you know this. It's quite old now. I think it's from like 2008, around then. There was a machine soldier created, a robot essentially that looked a little bit like, I suppose, a bomb defusing robot, which is of course a good application of the technology because then you're not putting humans in harm's way. But it looked like that, but it could essentially self-power itself by consuming the bodies of the killed soldiers that it had taken out. Have you heard about this?
I haven't, no.
Now, when this news story broke, and people said, wow, that's fucked up, it's a cannibalistic Holocaust machine, with deliberate reference to the film. The army came out in a very carefully crafted press release and said, no, it consumes bracken and wildlife. Obviously, that's bullshit. But it is amazing that this technology has been around for quite a while now. And I think you are absolutely right. The idea of that kind of autonomousness, because there are certain versions of technological autonomy which are very good, but that kind of application of technological autonomy, I think, is deeply troubling. Have you seen a marked increase in that type of technology recently?
I think that's where we're being taken. The problem is with most military technology is that what tends to happen is we tend to produce it. We tend to push the boundaries as far and as hard as we can, and it's almost becomes a goal in its own right to produce this stuff. And then we think about it afterwards about whether we actually need to control the proliferation of it, or whether we actually need new systems of international law to actually control these things. And that keeps happening, and I'm convinced that's where we're going to head with this as well. I mean, there's a whole host of technologies coming together all in one place at the moment. So you were talking then about the financial trading there, and the way these things are almost sort of coming together. And I mean, we've already seen with drones, the development of swarms. That's a readily available technology. You can have swarms of small drones flying, in set patterns, etc. If you then start to build kind of autonomous workings into kind of swarms of drones, it starts to get a little bit freaky. And we always kind of think about how best to control these things after they're already sort of out in the wild, as it were. So we have that kind of meeting of various technological strands all coming together at one point, and it's computer-based stuff. It's the developments in aircrafts and missiles and all sorts of things coming together with the development of computer programming. So these things are only going to be as good as the algorithms that go into actually allowing them to make decisions or not make decisions as to whether to strike. And actually, that links in with one of the sort of more gruesome aspects of the US drone program, which is the distinction that they have. They essentially make two types of strikes. So they have what they call personality strikes, which target specific suspects based on intelligence. So be it interceptor communications, human intelligence on the ground, whatever it might be. But it's an intelligence-led targeting, and they're called personality strikes, and they target a specific personality. They also have what they call signature strikes, which target individuals, and most of this stuff's being deployed in Pakistan at the moment, but they target individuals based on a sort of predetermined set of behavior, predetermined signature that US intelligence basically links to kind of militancy and militant activity. And at the moment, we have a kind of human in the loop saying, no, that's fine. That's just I don't know, whatever, a meeting of elders, it's fine. You've got to wonder where this technology is taking us once you start getting the potential for autonomous systems making signature strikes, out in Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, wherever it might be.
I have an article to read to you. It's very short, and I want to see what your take on it is. This, I should say, when it was written, because that would help. It was May 23rd of this year, and it's called Obama, Here's When It's Okay to Kill an American Citizen with a Drone. In a major speech on U.S. counterterrorism policy Thursday, President Barack Obama laid out his administration's legal framework for drone strikes, including those that target American citizens with legal force. The speech came one day after the Obama administration declassified information about the 2011 drone strike that killed Anwar Avlaki, an American citizen who led external operations for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, as well as strikes that killed 3 other American citizens. Did you hear about this?
Yes, yeah.
What's your take on this? Is this the thin end of the wedge, or is this happening much more than is reported? What's going on?
I think what we're seeing is, we've talked quite a lot about the kind of coming together of various technologies, and essentially all that does is allow you to make different policy decisions. So we have on one side we have is coming together different technologies and different capabilities, which also happen to tie in very nicely with an ongoing and developing US doctrine that's kind of come from the war on terror and has become a kind of global war on terror. And the two things are coming together and allowing Obama is now to make decisions and do different things. And the frightening thing is that with the justification that they have for deploying these things all around the world, be it to strike their own citizens or Pakistanis or Yemenis, is this kind of authorization to use military force that came from sort of following the 9/11 attacks, that basically allows the American military machine to target anyone that they believe to have been somehow linked to 9/11, and they're still using this piece of legislation. Where are we now? 12 years later, to sort of justify attacks that have nothing to do with 9/11. The sort of the links are beyond tenuous, and that needs to change. I mean, that's just a kind of fig leaf for gross violations of international law. I mean, for me, I'm not so concerned about whether Obama's using them to target US citizens or Pakistani citizens or Yemeni citizens. I mean, I understand that as a point of principle, the president shouldn't have the power to order military force to target their own citizens. But to me, I think death is death, whether you're whatever nationality you happen to be, and it's warring when they're deployed against anyone. But what this is allowing him to do, and it's all coming together and allowing him to do. I mean, you can't imagine Obama sending US bombers into Pakistani airspace to bomb, rural villages day in, day out without any kind of comeback. It just wouldn't happen. But somehow the use of drones seems to have kind of temporarily sidestepped international law. And it's setting a dangerous precedent. I mean, going back to the work that we did on armed drones in Russia and in Israel, in Iran, China, America has already set a dangerous precedent with the use of drones that other countries will follow.
I should point out, by the way, as a side note, that your website is openbriefing.org, isn't it? And not openbriefing.com.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's openbriefing.org. Yeah.
That's very important because openbriefing.com appears to be an investor relations platform that is essentially completely counter, I suppose, to yours, but would no more serve as a venue for this kind of discussion than maybe the trading floors of the US stock exchange. But yeah, this point about drones is interesting because it's also that it's essentially, you are right, when you strip away all of the technology and everything except the policy, we come down to this bizarre value system about a particular behavior of power towards the population. I'm reminded deliberately of the whistleblower Edward Snowden and the various projects that have been described, including the most recent one, Co-Traveler, where essentially the NSA, the No Such Agency, as I've heard them described, are essentially tracking every single mobile phone on the planet on a daily basis. Every communication, every time that you're hanging out with someone because the phones are in close contact, that kind of information as well. Do you think, and are you seeing this sort of knowledge, this sort of intelligence, if you like, or at least the raw information that provides them, even retrospectively or retroactively with intelligence, is essentially being married up with very advanced drone warfare?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, when they have signature strikes and personality strikes, and the intelligence that allows them to make those personality strikes comes from, well, as we now know, a huge array of sources, and from massive amounts of data that they can filter for patterns. And the use of kind of big data and intelligence is a whole new game that is, we're just sort of slowly beginning to kind of even begin to understand that they have these capabilities, and it certainly provides the government with a whole different source of information with which to use. Again, it's coming back to that argument I made earlier, that with all these things, the technology tends to outpace our ability to not even police it, our ability to even think about it. Should we be doing this? Is this a valid use of resources? Is it valid that governments are able to do this? And we're having these discussions we're sort of trying to we're talking about the way that we should close the gate well long after the horse has already bolted. And it's interesting, and it's a difficult one to kind of disentangle. I'm not too sure quite where we're going to head with that kind of meeting of kind of massive amounts of data and the intelligence that it enables, combined with new forms of military technology, and where that will take us.
How do you deliver your message to essentially the power establishment once you've done your research? How do you pitch this?
It depends, really. It depends who and why we've done the research. So a lot of what we do is actually for specific individual clients, for specific individual organizations. So they will come to us with an intelligence request, something that they need fulfilling in order to, I don't know, take forward an advocacy plan or to engage some kind of targeted policy development. And so in that instance, we have a kind of ready-made audience, if you like. Someone has come to us wanting this information. So that's a fairly clear-cut dissemination path, if you like. But even in those instances, and even when we've had a paid client, we always make sure that everything we do goes up on our website for free, can be accessed by anyone for free on our website, so that it doesn't become part of that kind of closed intelligence circle again, that it's readily available for everybody. And then beyond that, there's the usual dissemination pathways through social media, etc. And then we would work with, if it was particular types of work, we might work with, say, journalists to try and get it into the media. We would work to approach specific named policymakers or politicians to try and take it forward and to garner interest within government circles if that was appropriate. But we tend to work directly with other civil society organizations, and we kind of think of it's almost like the way we work is almost like throwing sort of pebbles in a pond, and the ripples set off effects. And by being in the background and by helping civil society groups make decisions based on intelligence rather than ideology, we can then influence their advocacy decisions, and those ripples go out through policy. That's the kind of approach that we take.
What would you count amongst your successes over the last couple of years of your work? The first 2 years, we should say.
That's right. Yeah, I think to be honest, the biggest success was just getting the thing off the ground and getting it funded and getting it up and running, because it was it's a pretty unique project that we're trying to do, and it's trying to get people's heads around it can be quite difficult sometimes. They kind of look at me sometimes and go, but you're just a think tank, and it's like, well, no, actually it's not. We're deploying a whole different model, a whole different approach to intelligence that most think tanks don't use, and that just getting that kind of off the ground was I think probably a pretty successful thing in its own right. But we've done some work that I've kind of been particularly pleased with, particularly proud of, I guess. And I mean, the most obvious one is the work that we've been talking about on armed drones. That was a really that was a really good piece of work, and that was a really important piece of work, and that was for a client called the Remote Control Project. It's a new civil society organization starting up, and that was really well received, and I was really pleased with that. But we've also done work for other people on corruption in the pharmaceutical supply chain to the developing world. We've done work on special forces, on private military and security companies. We've done we've carried out work on a whole host of issues, and I think when we work at our best is when we do work on issues that are just sort of ever so slightly below the radar, or ever so slightly kind of off the mainstream radars, the mainstream media's radar, and we can kind of come in with kind of a succinct, detailed, objective look at an issue that's not kind of currently on people's agenda. And I like it when we do work like that. And I think that's quite an important place for us. And just slowly over the last 2 years, we're beginning to get more and more subscribers. We have we offer a free political and security risk update called the Weekly Briefing, which you can subscribe to through our website. We're getting more and more subscribers signing up to that, more and more people joining our social networks, etc. More and more people making donations, and they're all nice ways of knowing that our work is being appreciated, I think, and from a larger constituency.
May I ask, actually, who funds you? I mean, who provided the backbone for you and was as brave as they were to back a project like yours?
Yeah, sure. The first funder we had was the Marmot Charitable Trust, and we've also been funded by the Pold and Puckham Charitable Foundation, the Network for Social Change, and the Philharmonic Trust. And interestingly, at least 2 of those are Quaker funders, because obviously the Quaker kind of dedication to pursuing peace and their pacifist perspective makes them actually huge funders of the peace and security sector in the UK. But yeah, they were the first, particularly Marmot, and they were the first ones to kind of stick their neck out and give us seed funding and support us. The Network for Social Change is an interesting one, because that is essentially a group of donors, a group of individual donors, philanthropic givers who come together, and rather than kind of each making their own individual donations to organizations they believe in or whatever, they come together collectively to fund organizations, and you have a sponsor within the organization who pitches your idea to them, and people donate money. And we've actually, I think we've received grants from them twice in the past, and we've got a grant application being reviewed at the moment, and certainly both times in the past we've actually received more money than we asked for. So that's quite an interesting model. But yeah, the Quakers, they're without them there would be no British peace and security sector at the moment.
It's very interesting you bring up the Quakers. Their, of course, most famous sentiment expressed as a sentence is speaking truth to power. That phrase comes from them. And of course, they have traditionally been, in often cases, of course, the landed gentry, but a pacifist landed gentry have demanded a peaceful core to governance. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, speaking truth to power is something that we actually explicitly highlight in our material, in our proposal, because I think, apart from anything else, it's a great turn of phrase, and essentially we exist to help people speak truth to power, and I think that's why funders like what we do.
That's fantastic. It answers my next question, which is going to be: do you ever find yourself in situations where you're conflicted with what your funders' opinions may be? That's always fascinated me, because it is innately going to be a problem with anybody who is questioning the bedrock upon which those funders are sometimes based. I'm thinking particularly of a group called Positive Money. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're founded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, a couple of other foundations. And it's very interesting because, of course, they're demanding monetary reform, 100% reserve banking and all this stuff, which would immediately affect literally any funder, because, of course, the definition of their fundability is the fact that they have money to invest or to play. So that's always an interesting challenge. I hope it's one you never meet, or have you found you've met it?
No, we haven't met it yet, but I mean, funders tend to fund organizations that they inherently agree with their ethos, etc. So, for example, we probably would, I doubt we would ever get a hugely right-wing funder, for example. They just wouldn't necessarily agree with our approach. But we do have a very strict ethical policy, and we would never accept any source of funding that we thought might jeopardize our independence. I mean, the whole bedrock and the whole reason behind OpenBriefing is to maintain an objective and rigorous outlook and rigorous approach to research, and we would never allow any source of funding to jeopardize that. It would threaten our very existence. So we're very careful when we consider the sources of funding that we would either approach or accept. And they would in no way be allowed to affect the work we do or threaten our independence. If it ever came down to that, we would just hand the money back.
Good to hear it. Good to hear it. It's such a rare sentiment these days, and it's built into the work you do, which is the good thing about it. I often find that people who peddle certain worldviews that are largely in line with current social operation tend also to have an extra, they'll call themselves something else on top of it, to philosophically almost graft a value system on top of what is really going on with the worldview that they hold. I can give you an example because it sounds a bit abstract. A lot of people who are primitivists or who are rugged individualists, people who promote what they call a true free market, the idea of each person, using his labors to satisfy the others, all that kind of stuff, tend to also call themselves libertarians because there's the non-aggression principle built into it, which is meant to be the regulating force behind the market itself, right? Okay, so basically my point is there are people who have a certain worldview who have to then entertain an additional worldview that may be unrelated or may be incompatible as an excuse for the first. So you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Rather not to see that you have, obviously a worldview, you can't be conflicted about this, promoting civil society values whilst being some kind of psychopathic capitalist. Have a very strange life indeed.
That would be confusing.
God damn it! I've got to publish another lefty report about the road.
Yeah, no, that would be very confusing. No, but I mean, we never, and that's one of the joys, going right back to the beginning of the conversation, that's one of the joys about having a volunteer network, is that, we could hand back every penny and still maintain a level of activity that had meaning. And that's always in the back pocket, as it were. It's not anything that's ever come up so far, but it's, if it did come up, we wouldn't think twice. We can't allow, there's no point seeking funding to do something you believe in if that funding jeopardizes your beliefs in that. I mean, what's the point, So we certainly would never allow a source of funding to sort of jeopardize our project. That just wasn't part of the way we work.
What do you see in the coming years as these two different or differing worldviews continue to collide? On one side, the relatively small civil society, pacifistic, harmony-based, real-world fact-based society. And on the other side, the value sets of empire, of capital, and of more and more subtle and varied forms of violence tend to collide. What do you see coming in the next few years?
Truthfully, I don't know at this stage. I mean, one thing I think we tend to sort of overlook, especially when we're dealing with kind of global issues, or we have an approach that is global in nature and sees things kind of holistically and looks at the interconnections, is that we often overlook the role of individual people within that. And so much is dependent upon those who come to power, those who come to roles of influence, those that are able to wield influence over people. Those individual people that come to the forefront throughout history do help shape history and will help shape the next 10 years, the next 20 years. So as all these strands come together, some of the things we've been talking about over the last hour or so, the strands of policy, the strands of technology, the strands of worldview, as these begin to come together, the direction we take will be influenced and knocked off course and spun on its head and by individuals. And it's difficult at this point to obviously predict, where the next Nelson Mandela is going to come from, or where the next George Bush is going to come from.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting point. It reminds me, for some reason, when you talk about individuals, granted you're talking about individuals who have influence, but you remind me for some reason of a poem whose first verse I once memorized. It's very famous because everybody has seen Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I'm talking, of course, the classic with Gene Wilder. But
There's another one?
Yes, well, yeah, absolutely. No, there's only the Johnny Depp one, which is, of course, far less good. But yes, it was just simply called Ode, and it starts by saying, "We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams," which is the line that Gene Wilder uses as Willy Wonka himself. But he ends the stanza by saying that essentially they are the ones that shape the world in the end. They're the ones that have the real effects, you know. We are the movers and shakers of the world forever, it seems, he ends up with, deliberately rhyming it with the opening line as well. And so I see that very much as your work. I hope that it's part of our work as well, is to inform, as we call it, the zeitgeist, you know, the general spirit of the age, into which all of this must form. And all of this must have a sort of a cumulative effect. So I wish you all the best with your project in trying to do that, because I think it's good to come across organizations that have real clout on the internet, you know, have a decent, strong presence and have multiple ways of following it. I think it's a decent thing. So keep on fighting the fight, so to speak.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Chris for coming on the show and explaining that to us. Do check out his website. Do check out our websites. Check out tzmchapters.net if you need to get involved. And look out for announcements regarding Z-Day wherever you are across the world. There will be many. There should be one near you. If not, why not try and start one and look around, cast about for help and ideas. There's always somebody on hand. Anyway, that's enough from me for this week. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back very soon. Bye-bye.